Hello, I am Joel McLeod.
I'm Roland Tanner.
And welcome to the 905er. In the last few weeks for this podcast, you might have noticed that a theme has appeared. Homelessness has crept back into the forefront of discussions here in the 905, especially in Hamilton, where the city has struggled to get a handle on the problem and proper solutions. The public reception to the city's policies has been, very controversial. In November, you may remember that the police dismantled homeless encampments in J.C. Beemer Park, leading to a large amount of criticism of excessive force and questioning if they were the best tool to use to solve this issue. More recently, a grassroots initiative of building tiny shelters for the homeless on the site of the former Sir John A MacDonald School has shown real entrepreneurship and innovation to the problem. We recently had Ted McMeekin on to discuss the potential and hope for this initiative and how it might change the shape of Hamilton's approach to homelessness in the future. However, we were not finished talking about this complex issue. Homelessness often gets framed in terms of a housing issue, rather than the complex one of social needs and mental health illnesses that often exist in the community. We wanted to get a better understanding of what exactly the issues happening on the ground were and how we got here. To that end, we invited Denise Davy to the podcast. Denise is an award-winning journalist and former reporter for The Spec. She wrote a book titled Her Name Was Margaret, which outlined the tribulations of a homeless woman named Margaret. Denise has written numerous times on the issue of homelessness and its causes, and today we speak with her to better understand the issue, how we need to reframe our conversations on homelessness, if we are to solve it, and how to work to help those on the streets. Now, before we start the interview, we'd like to take a moment to remind you to subscribe to our Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee accounts. For a small fee, you'll help us tell stories like this one that are so important to the 905 region. Links are in the show notes. Thank you to Denise Davy for taking time from her schedule to come on to the 905er podcast. Denise, very much pleased to have you on and to talk about a perpetual issue that seems to play, I don't want to say plague, but it affects not just Hamilton, but municipalities all over the 905 region, and that is the issue of, homelessness. So Denise, thank you for coming on to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Joel and Roland. Really appreciate it.
Now, the reason why we had you on is you wrote a book called Her Name Was Margaret, that looks at the issue of homelessness from the point of view of just a single individual, named Margaret. Let's start off with there. Let's just if you want to start off just by giving us a bit of insight into the book and just who Margaret was and kind of that framework, and maybe we'll go off from there.
Yeah, so I met Margaret back when I was a reporter at The Spec, and I decided to spend the night in the Wesley Center Emergency Shelter, which was located behind the police station on Rebecca Street. They've since moved it, but I went there about 11 p.m. on a Sunday night, very cold night in January, and she walked in around midnight, and that moment changed my life because I just knew I had to write a story on this poor, tragic, beaten down woman sitting across the room from me. And I had a couple of very lucky things that happened. One was that she agreed to speak to me, and she'd been going to the Wesley for almost 10 years and had never really told anybody her story. And so she opened up to me. And the second thing was that the Hamilton Psychiatric Hospital agreed to give me access to her files, which was like 870 pages. Of files that took over 24 years that she spent in the HPH. And today they probably would not do that. They gave me access to them just to read in the library at the HPH. Later, I met a family member, and they actually bought the files and then gave them to me. So that's how I was able to access them. But the third lucky strike was that her family was just so generous. They didn't know who Margaret was. She was a mystery to them too, and they gave me full access. They sent me tons of photos, allowed me to interview them, and like I said, just giving me the files themselves. And so that allowed me to do this full, complete, very detailed look at her life from birth to death. And that's when I discovered through Margaret's story the larger issue of deinstitutionalization and what had happened to people when all the psychiatric hospital beds, 80%, were closed across this country, sort of starting in the 60s and heading into the 80s and 90s. And then in the 80s and 90s, those closures overlapped with the closing of the shutting down of affordable housing, supportive housing funds. So that was a major problem, that those two were happening at the same time. And this is what I tell people, is that this is a man-made problem. This is not, and I say that because there were probably a few women in government in the 60s. This is not something that just has happened. This has been created, the systematic dismantling of our mental health system. It just went from having a system that wasn't perfect, but it was providing people like Margaret, who had a very complex form of schizophrenia. It was providing people like her with a roof over her head and 3 meals a day. And she actually wanted to stay in the hospital, but because of the bed closures, they just kept moving her out into these very rundown, poorly supervised boarding homes, which are still problematic. They're now called residential care facilities. They're still being shut down because of safety and hygiene issues. And she would be moved from a hospital where she had 24/7 care onto these boarding homes where she virtually had nobody to look after her. And the outcome was obvious. You don't have to be a psychiatrist to see that this would just be a plan that would fall apart. So she would just end up on the streets. She'd get picked up by an ambulance, and because she was so sick, and taken back to the HPH, and they'd just patch her up, as one of the social workers told me, get her health back to normal, put her on medication. A couple of weeks later, they'd put her back in one of these homes. And after 24 years, she finally just said, that's it, I'm not going back. And when I met her, she'd been homeless almost 10 years.
How common is this situation? Because I think there's a public perception that mental illness it's not really it might be an issue with some homelessness, or just maybe just give us a sense, like how widespread is this, is Margaret's case amongst the homeless population of Hamilton?
One of the most shocking statistics I found was both in terms of the mental and physical health of homeless people. I knew it wasn't good, obviously, when you're living that kind of rough lifestyle. But at Canadian Association of Mental Health, they say up to 70% of people on the streets have some kind of mental illness. And I've done several interviews in homeless shelters, and I've talked to a lot of people who are homeless, and I'd have to say it's even 80%. And I bet shelter staff would tell you the same. It's depression and anxiety are the most common mental illness or mental health problem within the general population, and within homeless population, they're huge. And for obvious reasons. These are people that every day is about survival. And, people say, well, why don't they do this or look for a job or get a haircut or whatever? They're just thinking, where am I going to sleep tonight so I don't die? Where am I going to go for my next meal? Right now, especially, we're having this long, very cold, snowy winter, and literally people are sleeping outside. And so the amount of level of mental illness among the homeless people is really through the roof. And a lot of it's not diagnosed.
So, I mean, because I think the public perception is, well, at least, a common refrain that we hear from political leadership on this matter is these people do it to themselves. They need to pick themselves up by their bootstraps and go get a job, and whatever phrase you want to throw in there. The idea is they've done this to themselves. They get what they deserve, I think, is the underlying consensus towards this. And what you're telling me is that, this isn't necessarily the case. If you're 80% of a population that's dealing with mental illness, severe mental illness, that's not as simple a case of, dust yourself off, go into a job, get an application and fill it out. It's, these are complex needs that need to be addressed.
There's a lot. Yeah, that's right. That's why this, it's called Housing First Initiative, which I'm sure you've heard about. That's why it's been so successful, because they not only provide housing or shelter and roof over their head, they look at the things they need in terms of psychiatrists, budgeting problems, childcare if they're a single mom, issues with the courts. They look at the wraparound services and tailor those to each individual. And that's why the Housing First is so important. And the other thing is getting them before it becomes embedded as this lifestyle. Because with Margaret, she was on the street so long. Even at one point, I write in the book about her lovely boyfriend, Bob Dixon, who was just a sweetheart, and took her into his apartment for a year. But she would just, in the middle of winter, she'd just bolt and just take off for a couple of days and be sleeping outside because she was just, it was just part of her lifestyle. And I mean, they're not able to really make, really healthy, rational decisions, and that's part of their illness. So really need to understand that about people, that this is something I need to get across to people. It's that homelessness is not a choice, because choices are made when you have healthy options and you're in a healthy place to make those decisions. Those are choices. It's not when you're acting out of desperation and you're not really able to think about really well thought plans. Like there's no such thing as sort of long-term planning when you're homeless. It's like day to day, sometimes hour to hour. And I sometimes get the feeling that some people think that they're just like having fun camping. As you say, too lazy. I have to think, though, from my experience, like most people, I do think that they are. I do think most of the public are concerned about people sleeping outside, and they just don't know what to do.
You see, I mean, like literally, I think not last week, the week before, the Hamilton Council were discussing this, and Mayor Eisenberger kind of belabored the point. Well, some of these people, they just don't want to live indoors. These are the kind of hardcore of people. We're never going to find a solution for them. So perhaps I'm being slightly unfair to him, but I don't think I'm being very unfair. The kind of gist is, we can't do anything about these people. They're just too much hard work. So, any solution you come up with that suggests an improvement is, well, don't bother. I mean, I guess there's a valid element of truth in amongst the element I feel is not, which is give up. I don't accept that part of it. But these are people with all kinds of challenges, and particularly if given the choice between living, say, in a tent, when we had the whole tent debate a few months ago, and living in or spending your nights in a shelter, I think I'd probably choose the tent. So I don't quite know where I'm going with this point, other than these assumptions seem the assumptions of just, this is difficult, so give up, seems like something we should be challenging. I don't know. What do you think about that? I
do think that, and I guess that's what frustrates me the most. I think our city councilors council thinks that they are trying their hardest and they're working with the information in front of them. But I think what they need is to get out from behind the desks and just go down there, and not just one visit. But several, because if you're going to do your research and make a decision, and you're in this very powerful position, do your research. That's as a journalist. I do my research before I write a story. And I think the thing is, once they understood the level of illness, mental and physical, among people living on the streets, and as you say, Roland, the shelters. I've read about this a lot, where the people have, especially women, have experienced violence and been robbed in shelters. They're deadly afraid of the virus, and they were even before COVID. And it's a valid fear. They're, like they said, they're making that decision from a very sound, rational perspective that it isn't necessarily safe. I read a study in, I think it was Toronto shelters. 50 Toronto shelters right now are in outbreak mode. And I read something on Twitter that the majority of all the men's shelters in Hamilton are in outbreak mode as well. So, they weren't safe before completely, and people were getting robbed, and there were thefts. And that's not because of that. I don't want to lay any of the blame on shelters. They are so poorly funded. I did a column for the Star a couple of weeks ago, and I said, we need this, this, and this. We need separate rooms. The way now our hospitals, after the outbreaks there, have infection control layouts where everybody's in single rooms, and we need to have more single rooms in shelters and people that are a safe distance apart. But I've been inside the shelters; there's no space, and so it would take money to do that. But in the long run, this is the frustrating thing: it would cost us much less, because studies have shown it could be anywhere from like 50, 60,000 up to 120,000 a year to keep somebody on the street.
Well, I was just going to say, coming back to that two things occurred to me. One, that as a society, we have incredibly short memories. This wasn't always a state of affairs. This is a relatively, in big scheme of history, a new state of affairs. You know, and the words we used to use for homeless people, like hobo and tramp, I mean, they're not compliments, but they were, you know, these are itinerant people who go from place to place, often looking for, you know, odd jobs or whatever. It was not a permanent population of people who lived on the streets, and
and they're all men.
And this, exactly. There were no female hobos. Why did this happen? Why did going back, you know, from the 60s to the 80s? Why was there such a dramatic change? You talked about the closures of the psychiatric hospitals, but what was the logic behind that, and what went wrong?
Yeah, the jumping off point, the reason for it was, and it was a positive thing, was the introduction of these psychotropic drugs, where clorazepam and those sort of medications came onto the market. And the first time in the history of civilization there was anything to manage mental illness symptoms. So that was all seen as a positive thing. And the deinstitutionalization was seen as a positive thing. I mean, I quote people like Jimmy Carter in my book saying, like, this is a wonderful thing. Like, that even with a physical health problem, they've shown more healthy to heal at home with community support. So you're in the, you know, your own surroundings, you've got your loving family around you, you get more independence. And so it was welcomed with open arms. People were thrilled this was happening. And they, like I said, they didn't follow through on the community-based support. So the plan was move the people out and then put mental health clinics in the neighborhoods where the people would be relocated, which a lot of it was inner city. Hire outreach workers, social workers, nurses, paramedics, everything to visit the home so they'd have a full wraparound service for all these people. And none of that happened. They just moved people into these homes that were completely unsupervised. The one social worker, Pat Saunders, I talked to, who knew Margaret and was in the HPH when she was there, she said she went and talked to the boarding home operation and said, could you just please, I know you can't do everything, but can you just make sure that she takes her medication? And he said, you think I'm a psychiatrist? No. So, you know, with schizophrenia, especially complex form like Margaret had, medication is seriously important. So as soon as she went off her medication, she just spiraled downwards and wouldn't eat, wouldn't come home. So one of these homes that she was in served, here's an example, cold cereal and cold water for breakfast, and then moved everybody out of the home by 9 a.m. and locked the door. And there was no rules to say they couldn't do that. 5, 6 o'clock, they let them all in, regardless of the weather, and, you know, served them some minor meal, probably totally lacking in nutrition for dinner. And, you know, they'd have a bed to sleep in. And one of the homes had just single cots all lined up in the living room and actually were touching each other. So there were like 8 of them. So no privacy and nothing was regulated. It was just unbelievable that they would go from the sort of 24/7 care they had in hospitals to virtually nothing. And this was just allowed to happen. So yes, it all started because of the medication.
It just strikes me that it just seems that we're looking for an excuse just to get this out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah.
You start, the medication comes in and says, hey, okay, we've got this. So that's the solution. Okay. Pump them full of drugs and, give them to the charity of strangers. It was kind of public policy almost. And I'd say that the out of sight, out of mind mentality, because flash forward to last year with the tent encampments in J.C. Beemer Park here in Hamilton, the circumstances with COVID, as you said, the pandemic virus raging through missions and shelters, and that rightfully so, they're concerned about their own health. Understandable. There are people who are struggling now because of supports are ending for the pandemic, whatever. And the attitude wasn't this, a compassionate, this is a problem, we need to solve it. It was sending the police clear them out because we can't ignore them if they're in a public park. It was kind of the I'm not going to say it was the official policy. I don't have any reason to say that, but just the attitude of that was just, we can't ignore people if they're in a public park. We can't ignore them if they're if they're camping in the park. Am I overreaching with that analysis of our attitude towards the homeless? It was just, let's keep them out of sight, out of mind.
Oh no, the whole problem started because of the tents. Wasn't all this talk and Although, I mean, the COVID certainly brought out the issue, but there wasn't as much of outrage when they were safely hidden down our alleyways and stuff. They were just that they were made visible with the tents, and and they started showing up in our parks again out of desperation. But one of the things I heard about the encampments was that these staff would go and let people know 2 or 3 times that they were going to be torn down. So number one, and they'd offer them housing on the spot. So number one, they didn't tell them when they were going to come back and actually bulldoze it. But even if they had, it's not like, they'd say, well, just check my schedule, see if I'm open January 27th. It's just, like I said, there's not like sort of long-term planning. There's not just mental illness. There's addiction problems in there, and some of them self-medicate because they're not on medication for schizophrenia and that sort of issues. But I know what the Councillor Nan was suggesting was, so on those lead up to it, they would have somebody there from housing supports to say, we could take you to housing now, let's go. And they'd say, well, I don't want to go. That became their community, or they had a partner with them. And there's no sort of partner shelters that allow partners or couples. So, but what Councillor Nan was asking for was the day of when they come and actually tear down the tents. Can you have somebody then at that point could put them in housing? And they weren't. It was just a tear down.
And it seems so obvious. And I'm not going to defend the police, because it seems that some of the things that went on were at the very minimum troubling. But
especially Toronto,
it should never get to, when it gets to the point that the police are going in, you've already failed 1,000 times over. There's so many things that should happen before that. There's no business sending the police into, there may be all kinds of challenges with these people, but they're not. You don't need to send the army in here, guys. They're not sitting in downtown Ottawa with trucks. Say, you can actually move them easier than that. I mean, it's really. I mean, I think far more criticism should ultimately go to City Hall and their handling than the police, who just shouldn't have been there in the first place. I guess is kind of what I'm saying. Now, there's been just in the last weeks, there's been we interviewed Ted McMeekin about the HATS project, the Hamilton Alliance for Tiny Shelters, and I mean that seems. It seems on the surface to someone who's not an expert in the field like, well, this is a great idea. What's your take on that project?
I think it's a very positive step forward. And I listened to the delegation with Julia on last week, the Emergency Community Service meeting. And, the thing that struck me is when she said we could basically have these things up and built within weeks. And I just look at, 2 homeless people I know right now. There's a woman, if anybody's gone for a walk down Bayfront Trail, there's a woman who set up a big tarp with grocery carts and wood, and she's literally just living beside the trail there in the, some of the temperatures, that's 30 below this some nights. I just think we need to put all our resources on getting people like that into some sort of housing. And I know it's temporary, and it's not, the ultimate solution. But I mean, when it's actual life and death and survival situations like that, I'm totally in favor of them. And for people like the woman in the on the Bayfront Trail, and there's a fellow I was talking about earlier. I'm sure everybody's seen him. He's living in a pile of garbage beside York Boulevard. It's not going to be an easy sell. They often have rejected shelters because a lot of people with mental illness have a real fear of crowded, chaotic spaces and loud noises, and they can't stand a lot of people being around them. And so, it may take some doing to get them into that kind of shelter. But I honestly think it would be a fantastic thing. I think they'd fill up pretty quickly because so many people need it.
Stepping on that or off of that note, what should municipalities in the 905 be looking at doing to address this, address the issue, rather than just funding? I think we've agreed that we're past just funding mission shelters and just putting beds, but like in terms of like a real concrete, like a path to reintegrate these individuals back into society, to give them a path to not just survive, but to actually thrive. How should we be changing our approach to this problem?
Well, that's because the problem is we're in crisis mode, and that's to rework that around. And I know Hamilton has a plan to end homelessness. I can't remember the year, but I wish it was sooner. But to get to a point where they're actually thriving, it's going to take some time. But I look at Medicine Hat, Alberta, that's ended homelessness, and the country of Finland. There's a city in Italy that doesn't even have psychiatric hospitals. They have no one living on the streets because they're so packed with community supports. It's just all community supports. And they treat the person like they're a whole person. It's not just about shelter and a roof over their head. It's, they have jobs. They have a whole community center that people go in and do arts and crafts. And you can actually buy their things there, and the money goes back to them, and that sort of wraparound services like that. But we need to get out of just barely managing it in crisis mode. And we can't do that unless we have things like the tiny homes where we do have resolve the life and death issues that are happening now and get people off the streets.
I mean, one of the problems is that institutions, government institutions are so big and unwieldy and so impersonal that people just fall between the cracks. And this isn't just to do with homelessness; it's to do with healthcare as a whole, to do with mental health in particular.
Yeah.
And it's like, how do we solve that? And it's that kind of holistic approach, isn't it? Where it's like, you can't send someone to this. Now, and again, to be fair, I know there was a reorganization at Hamilton City Hall a few years back when they reorganized I'm not sure of my facts here, but I know they had a reorganization that was partly aimed at doing that exact thing of kind of stopping the extent to which people had to go to 10 different offices to do 10 different things when it could all be done in one place. Great initiative, but clearly not, entirely doing the job that we need to be done. I mean, and how much of this, ultimately, if we had better mental health care in this province, how much do you think that would be? That's almost like the first, if you're going to put the horse in front of the cart, mental health care is the issue. And Ontario's mental health, in Canada as a whole, we don't really have a mental health care system per se.
Before I wrote about, I did a lot of research on children's mental health. And one of the places I visited was, I went out to Vancouver because in 2004, they became the first province in Canada to set up a province-wide children's mental health policy strategy. And it really reminds me of the homelessness issue because they needed to stop just being in crisis mode and switch their services around so that kids were getting help sooner. And they were more community-based, and everybody said, "Oh God, that's going to be impossible because you're going to have so many kids falling through the cracks because you're moving out all these emergency services." But they did it, and different governments have come along. They don't have the perfect system yet, but they certainly had a very positive one, and they were a role model for other provinces, but nobody followed up on it. But what I was trying to say is that our mental health system that exists for the homeless population is just as bad for the general population and people with homes. Kids are still waiting 18 months to 2 years to get into a child psychiatrist. It's been so much worse during the pandemic. Kids being diagnosed with eating disorders and anxiety has just gone through the roof, and that's a whole other issue.
The system such as it is incredibly overloaded before COVID, triply overloaded during COVID.
And I think with the homeless, the reason they got away with it was because they don't have a voice. They don't, like I've compared to cancer treatment. And I said, if the government announced, as they did with the psychiatric hospitals, that we're closing down half the treatment facilities within 5 years or so, and people would just have to fend for themselves. Or they offered an alternative, which never happened. If any of that happened, there'd be a massive outcry. they'd vote everybody out and get in a new government, but people who are homeless don't vote and tend to not vote as much, and they tend to have cut ties with the families, and so they're not as able to hold them as accountable. So that's the sad part.
It strikes me as a contradiction. I mean, we constantly come back to the issue of mental health with the homeless and just in general. But people are going to remember a few weeks ago we had the Bell Let's Talk Day. And, there was all this, we have to break down the stigmas of mental health and whatnot and that, and isn't it great? Yet we aren't talking about the fundamental need of, we need to actually it's not so much just talking anymore. I think we all understand mental health is an important aspect of our lives and our well-being as individuals. We don't treat it as important as our physical health. You're right. But, if somebody said to cancer patients, you're on your own, good luck to you, pay for the chemotherapy on your own, and good luck finding a clinic or a nurse that's going to put the needle in your arm or whatever have you, we'd be outraged. We just, that's right. Unconscionable. Yet we don't care about somebody who says, I'm having a hard time focusing. I don't know what the problem is. I don't know. I don't have a diagnosis. I just have a hard time focusing. I have a hard time keeping my life in order. Yeah. For whatever reason. We kind of say, again, it comes down to, you did this to yourself. Just get your act together and get on with
stiff
life.
Stiff upper lip.
Right. Yeah. Right. And that that stiff upper lip and just pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Right. Right.
And we kind of frown on the notion of actually asking for help. And there's no pressure to our political institutions, our government to say, we need to change this. Like, you need to include better holistic, I think, a new approach to addressing people's, I think, just healthcare in general in this province. That was just more of a rant than an actual question.
And I'm going to definitely need more attention on that, though. Yeah.
Yeah, and the stigma has. I'm not saying that the stigma is entirely gone. The stigma has decreased a huge amount. I'm willing to. I've said before on this podcast, and I'm willing to say, as someone, I'm in my second decade of mental health stuff myself. Fortunately, but for the grace of God, I'm okay. I got a home, and I do stuff. But it's been an eye opener, because what I've realized is there are two. We think of OHIP as covering our health, and it does if you've got a physical thing. But if you've got a mental thing, it really doesn't. It's your GP can give you medication, and your GP can refer you to a psychiatrist, and there's all kinds of amazing stuff. There's incredible staff who I just cannot speak about highly enough. However, it's so, compared with how we treat the body, it's so incredibly insufficient.
I think we've moved a little bit ahead. Like, there are, not that this is worth a ton, but I do feel like even with high profile people, celebrities coming forward and talking about their depression I do feel that's breaking a little bit of the stigma, and people are generally talking about it, but the services still aren't there. We still don't have, they say it should be far more community-based services, but far more attention. I think it's something like 20% of the health budget is on mental health funding, which is unbelievable. It should be like far more than that. So, we just
kind of feel like, I remember a friend of mine said years ago, sorry, and I'm talking over you very rudely. A friend of mine said years ago, like, everybody should have a therapist. Doesn't matter if you've got a problem or not. Everybody should have it. Like, you have a GP, you have, we have a dentist, you have a therapist. And maybe you never choose to see that therapist, but it's available to you when you need it. And in fact, that's just not something that happens. Most people would have to pay for that, and that ain't cheap, we have CMHA and all these amazing organizations. And just locally, like Joe Brandt does amazing things, but it's kind of papering over the cracks rather than a real system per se in it.
And to bring that back to the homeless, actually, Roland, a Mental Health Act. When I look at this fellow on York Boulevard, and I just think, like, are you kidding? That, like, the Mental Health Act that says, we can't do, if, unless they're a danger to themselves or others, you can't admit them to a hospital. And he clearly, to sleep outside in this temperature, you're clearly a danger to yourself. It's clearly, he could
Ipso
absolutely
facto.
freeze.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And, it's so sad to see that, the year way back when I interviewed Margaret and the terrible situation she was in. And I think, like, here we are today in 2022, still have people, and they say possibly, they said 30 to 35, but it's probably like 100 who are literally sleeping outside in this weather. Like, we should be far more angry and intolerant about that.
What strikes me interesting about this conversation, looking back on the last half hour, is how we've gone, we're kind of talking a bit about housing, and now we switched, like, the root cause of this is our mental health and our social safety nets to catch people as they fall through. And I just, the last kind of point I have before we have to bring this episode to a close is just, as much as we focus on housing, and we do talk about housing a lot on this podcast for various reasons, I find that our political leaders look at housing as the solution to homelessness, right? Oh, if we build more
which it partly is.
It partly is, but I mean, I think we've touched upon, like, the fact is you can give somebody a house, but if they themselves say, I can't live in there, I can't pay the mortgage on it, I can't pay the rent, I can't pay, I have all these other issues to sort out.
Supports.
It's just like you're setting people up to fail again. And I think part of it is just, instead of investing in a building, it's part of it, absolutely. We need to start investing in people. Mm-hmm. Giving them the networks to say, okay, you know what, your life is secure. You are like that hierarchy of needs, kind of thing. Okay, you know what, the security of your person is safe. You're safe. You're safe from violence, from the elements, etc. Fine. Now we need to start helping you get actualized as a person. Your illness taken care of or managed properly, and then how do you want to give you options to live your life how you see fit. And I just don't know if we're quite there yet in terms of our political initiative or our social will.
Well, I do feel like the people who I said, like the guy on York Boulevard, they're just accepted as the throwaways. They're just, we've given up. We've convinced ourselves there's nothing we can do. If they won't go in shelters, there's no other options. They've made this decision to sleep outside from a healthy perspective. That 100 different things have been tried and it's been rejected, and none of those are true. They're all, they've just decided from a point of ignorance, really, that homelessness can't be solved, and so they're willing to just walk away. But I think there's nothing more shameful to a country, a city, a province, than having people sleeping on our streets. It's absolutely shameful. It's really just a sad, tragic situation.
And it is. I think you're exactly right that these things exist because we as a society have accepted that they're going to exist and that they're too difficult to fix. Yeah. When you change your mentality and say this is not tolerable in this day and age, this is not, if the will is there, these problems will be solved. Yeah.
I quote Charles Krauthammer, who was a Washington Post columnist. I quote him in my book as saying 30 years ago, if you saw somebody laying on the street, you'd rush over because you thought he was a victim of a car accident or something, and you'd get him help. And now you just walk over him because you know he lives there. And it did used to be less tolerated. Like, we didn't used to allow this sort of thing. And now it's just, well, there's nothing you can do. Well, there's a lot we can do.
We bought into this idea that, well, many of us bought into the idea that we were overtaxed or that we couldn't afford or blah, blah, blah. And it's like, why is it that my parents and grandparents who had far fewer kind of luxuries than I do felt that they could pay for what was needed to keep people off the streets? Yeah. When did we buy this myth that we don't have the money anymore? I don't.
Yeah. And if there's just so surrounded by so many problems that they can't even think about the problems that homelessness, then worry about your taxes. Because to keep someone on the street, because like the Social Navigator program is an expensive program, much needed. that's your tax dollars. They go around and help the chronically homeless. And, we shouldn't be needing them. We shouldn't be needing people going in and bulldozing tents out of the cities and the cost of that. Because, and we wouldn't need it if we had proper housing for people and proper supports. So, and it would be much cheaper. Like Medicine Hat estimates they're spending about $24,000 a year to keep people housed.
Versus just huge. I mean, I remember hearing a statistic years ago about how much we pay for a very small number of people because they are so difficult to manage. Yeah. Living on the streets. It's such a false economy in every way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And for what? Just to perpetuate the problem.
I think we'll have to end it there because we're coming up on the end of the episode. But clearly this is a huge issue that we're only scratching the surface with in this 40 minutes. So I think as we look and see how the HATS initiative works in Hamilton, we'll probably want to revisit this later throughout the year and just see how that unfolds and what that looks like it'll shape into. So Denise, we'll probably reach out to you again at some point in the future and have you back on.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. That's it for this episode of the 905er. Thank you for listening. As always, you can send us your feedback, thoughts, and concerns or ideas for future episodes to our email, info@905er.ca. We'd love to hear from you. You can help us keep the 905er going by financially supporting us through Patreon as well as PayPal. Visit us at 905er.ca and click on the support tab. As well, links are in the show notes for your convenience. Lastly, you can find us on social media. Search for _905er on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So long for now. See you next time.
Looking to make the most out of this life and optimize your personal wellness? Then check out the Natural Man Podcast. Join me, host Mike C., as we explore all areas of human wellness, physical, mental, and emotional. Learn strategies to optimize your own well-being and be in the driver's seat of your own health. Remember, your doctor works for you. Learn biohacks, neurohacks, ways to improve sleep, and ways to optimize your body and your mind. Check us out on Apple, Spotify, the Fountain app, and at naturalmanpodcast.com.